The night was still, save for the occasional hum of cars passing by the street below. I sat in my room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, but my thoughts were far from the glowing screen. Something had been off lately, subtle, yet unmistakable. My cousin, Alex, had always been a quiet presence in the family, but over the past few weeks, his silence felt heavier, like it was carrying a secret he wasn't ready to share. It wasn't just his behavior that had changed. He'd started withdrawing during family gatherings, opting to sit in corners, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. His laughter, once loud and contagious, had become softer, almost hesitant. Even when we hung out one-on-one, something we'd done since we were kids, it felt like he was holding back, guarding a part of himself. I couldn't shake the memory of the last conversation we'd had. We were sitting in my backyard, under the string lights that gave the space a warm glow. I'd asked him if everything was okay, and for a moment, he looked at me like he wanted to say something. His lips parted, his eyes searching mine, but then he just shook his head and said, "I'm fine. Just tired." But it wasn't fine. I could feel it in the way he avoided eye contact, in the way his hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. That night, I didn't press him further, but the look on his face stayed with me. Tonight, I was determined to figure out what was going on. As cousins, we'd always had an unspoken bond, a connection that let us understand each other without words. I knew this was something bigger, something he couldn't say out loud yet. But I also knew Alex. If he felt seen, if he felt safe, he would let me in. The sound of a knock on my door broke my train of thought. "Come in," I called out, setting my phone aside. Alex stepped in, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. His face was pale, and he looked almost fragile, like a strong wind could knock him over. He hesitated at the door, glancing around my room before finally meeting my gaze. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, the weight of his question hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. Whatever he was about to say, I knew it would change everything. Alex and I had always been more like siblings than cousins. Growing up, we spent nearly every weekend together, running around the neighborhood, climbing trees, and inventing elaborate games only we understood. Even as we got older and life grew more complicated, we stayed close. While other family members often judged or teased, Alex and I offered each other an unspoken sanctuary, a place free of expectations. When Alex moved to the city for college, I was thrilled to have him living nearby. He'd often come over to my apartment, crashing on the couch after long nights of studying or just hanging out to watch movies. It became our ritual. Friday nights were reserved for takeout and bad comedies. It didn't matter how stressful our weeks had been. Those nights were sacred, a reminder of the bond we'd always shared. But lately, those moments had felt different. Alex seemed distracted, his usual jokes forced or absent altogether. He was still present physically, but his mind often seemed miles away. I'd catch him staring off into space or fiddling nervously with his phone, as if he were waiting for a message that never came. One evening, I decided to confront him in a roundabout way. We were sitting on the couch, the glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the room. A bowl of half-eaten popcorn sat forgotten between us. I turned to him and said, "You've been acting weird lately. What's going on?" Alex chuckled nervously, not meeting my eyes. "Weird? I'm not weird. You're weird." "Nice deflection," I replied, giving him a mock glare. "But seriously, Alex. I can tell something's up." He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tugging at a loose thread on his sleeve. "It's nothing. Just school stuff, you know?" I let it slide for the moment, sensing that he wasn't ready to open up. But as the weeks passed, more signs began to emerge. His once frequent texts became sporadic, and our Friday movie nights were filled with long silences where words should have been. One particular incident stuck with me. We were out grocery shopping together. Something Alex often insisted on, claiming my pantry was a sad excuse for sustenance. As we walked through the aisles, I noticed him glance nervously at a guy in the store, a subtle but unmistakable flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Do you know him?" I asked casually, nodding toward the stranger. Alex's face turned crimson, and he quickly shook his head. "No. Why would I?" His voice was a little too quick, a little too defensive. I didn't press further, but the moment left me curious. Who was that guy? And why did Alex react the way he did? Despite his best efforts to hide it, Alex's internal struggle was becoming harder to ignore. His once easygoing demeanor was now marked by hesitations and subtle tension. The carefree conversations we used to share felt increasingly guarded, like he was building walls between us. Still, in quieter moments, I'd catch glimpses of the old Alex. There was a night when we stayed up late, talking about our childhood memories. He laughed so hard at one point that he had tears streaming down his face, clutching his stomach as he tried to catch his breath. In those moments, it was easy to forget the distance that had crept into our relationship. But the cracks in his facade were growing. One afternoon, while helping me clean out my closet, Alex came across an old photo album. He flipped through the pages, his expression softening as he lingered on a picture of us as kids, arms slung around each other, grinning at the camera. "We were so happy back then," he murmured, almost to himself. "We still are," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and fear. "Yeah," he said softly, but his tone suggested otherwise. It was moments like these that made me realize how much Alex was holding back. The bond we shared was still there, but it was strained under the weight of whatever secret he was carrying. And as much as I wanted to help, I knew I couldn't force him to open up. He had to do it on his own terms. As the weeks passed, my determination to be there for Alex only grew stronger. I began to pay closer attention to the little things. His mood shifts, his choice of words, the way his eyes darted away whenever a particular topic came up. I didn't know what he was hiding, but I could feel its importance, its weight pressing down on him. I resolved to be patient, to give him the space he needed while also letting him know I was there. Deep down, I knew our bond was strong enough to weather whatever storm he was facing. It always had been. The shift was subtle at first, like a change in the wind that you can't quite pinpoint but feel nonetheless. Alex had always been reserved, but now his silences carried weight, a quiet tension that seemed to hang between us. I began noticing little things, his lingering glances, the way he hesitated before speaking, the faint smile that would sometimes flicker across his face before he quickly looked away. One evening, we were sitting on my balcony, sharing a pizza and watching the city lights. It was one of those rare moments where Alex seemed relaxed, his usual guarded demeanor slipping away. He leaned back in his chair, his hoodie pulled over his head, and sighed contentedly. "This is nice," he said, breaking the silence. "It is," I agreed, glancing at him. "You've seemed different lately. Happier, maybe?" Alex looked at me, his smile fading just slightly. "Yeah, I guess. Things are complicated." "Complicated how?" I asked, keeping my tone casual but curious. He hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his chair. "Just life stuff. You know how it is." But I didn't know, not really. Alex had always been an open book with me, and this new secrecy felt foreign, like a stranger had taken the place of my cousin. I didn't push him though. I knew better than to pry. The real turning point came a week later. Alex had come over to help me organize my bookshelves, a task he claimed I was horribly incompetent at. We were halfway through the process when I noticed a small notebook fall out of his backpack. "Hey, you dropped this," I said, picking it up. Alex's reaction was immediate and intense. He snatched the notebook from my hands, his face pale. "It's nothing," he said quickly, stuffing it back into his bag. I raised an eyebrow. "Okay, but you don't have to act like it's a classified document." He laughed nervously, but the tension in his voice was undeniable. "Seriously, it's nothing. Just some notes for a project." I let it go, but the moment stayed with me. What was in that notebook that had him so on edge? The following weekend, we went to a nearby park, something we often did when we needed a break from the monotony of city life. As we walked along the trails, Alex seemed lost in thought, his hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets. "You've been quiet today," I said, trying to draw him out. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice distant. "About what?" He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression conflicted. "Do you ever feel like you're living a double life? Like there's this part of you that no one really knows?" The question caught me off guard. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," I said carefully. "Why? Is that how you feel?" Alex didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked away, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't know. Maybe." For the first time, I saw a crack in the armor he'd been wearing for weeks. He was trying to say something, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. That night, as we sat in my living room, the shift in our dynamic became even more apparent. Alex seemed restless, his leg bouncing as he stared at the TV without really watching. I turned the volume down and said, "Hey, you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I know," he said softly. There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. "Is it about that guy at the store?" I asked, taking a leap of faith. Alex's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "You seemed nervous when you saw him. I just thought maybe—" "It's not what you think," he interrupted, his voice shaky. "Okay," I said, holding up my hands. "But whatever it is, you can tell me. You don't have to carry it alone." Alex's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long sigh. "I know. It's just hard." In that moment, I realized how much weight he'd been carrying, how deeply this secret, whatever it was, had been affecting him. The shift in our relationship was undeniable. We were no longer just cousins sharing carefree moments. We were two people navigating a complex and unspoken tension, each step bringing us closer to a truth that felt inevitable. As the night went on, Alex seemed to relax slightly, the walls he'd built around himself beginning to crumble. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a silent plea for understanding. I didn't push him to say more, but I made a silent promise to be there when he was ready. The shift in our dynamic wasn't just about Alex's secret, it was about trust, about the unspoken bond we'd always shared and how it was now being tested in ways we'd never anticipated. Whatever lay ahead, I knew this was only the beginning. The tension had been building for weeks, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Every glance, every half-finished sentence from Alex seemed to hint at something bigger, something he wasn't ready to share. I tried to be patient, to give him the space he needed, but the weight of it all was starting to feel unbearable. I knew that if I didn't address it, we might drift apart under the pressure of his silence. The confrontation happened on a quiet Friday evening. Alex had come over for dinner, but his mood was different, restless, almost agitated. He barely touched his food and kept checking his phone as if expecting some kind of signal to escape. "All right, what's going on?" I finally asked, setting my fork down. Alex looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting strange for weeks. You barely talk anymore, you're always on edge, and tonight you're not even pretending to be here. I'm not trying to push, but I can't keep pretending I don't notice." He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, his expression conflicted. "It's complicated," he muttered, the same phrase he'd used so many times before. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "I'm starting to hate that word, you know. Complicated. It feels like an excuse to avoid talking about whatever's really going on." Alex's shoulders tensed, and for a moment, I thought he might walk out. But then he sighed, a long heavy exhale that seemed to deflate him. "You don't understand," he said softly. "Then help me understand," I urged. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that felt like the world holding its breath. Alex stared down at his plate, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if steadying himself. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with fear and something else. Hope, maybe? "I'm not who you think I am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with meaning. I didn't respond immediately, afraid of saying the wrong thing and shutting him down. Instead, I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I've been hiding something for a long time," he said, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "Not just from you, but from everyone. And it's been eating me alive." I leaned forward, my tone gentle but firm. "Alex, whatever it is, you can tell me. You're my cousin, but more than that, you're my friend. Nothing you say will change that." He hesitated again, his hands now fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "I'm gay," he finally said, the words rushing out as if he was afraid they might choke him if he held them back any longer. For a moment, I just sat there, processing his confession. It wasn't a shock, I'd suspected for a while, but hearing him say it out loud was different. It felt monumental, like a door opening to a part of him he'd kept locked away. "Alex," I said carefully, "thank you for telling me. That must have been so hard to say." His eyes filled with tears, and he quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of his hoodie. "You're not mad?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Mad? Why would I be mad?" I asked, my own voice softening. "This doesn't change anything about how I feel about you. You're still Alex, my cousin, my friend, the guy who's always been there for me. This just means I get to know you even better now." He let out a shaky laugh, a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I was so scared," he admitted. I don't know what I thought. That you'd be disappointed, maybe, or that you'd think differently of me." I reached across the table and took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Alex, I'm proud of you. It takes so much courage to be honest about who you are, especially when you're scared of how people might react. But you don't have to be scared with me. I'm here for you, no matter what." His tears came freely now, and he didn't bother trying to hide them. "I've been carrying this for so long," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought if I kept it to myself, I could avoid all the judgment and rejection, but it's been so lonely. I didn't realize how much I needed to say it out loud until now." We sat there for a while, the silence between us no longer heavy but comforting. I could see the weight lifting from Alex's shoulders, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced with something lighter, freer. "Is this why you've been so distant lately?" I asked after a while. He nodded. "Yeah. And there's more to it. There's someone I like, but I've been too scared to tell him. I don't even know if he feels the same way, and the thought of putting myself out there is terrifying." I smiled. "Welcome to the club. That's not just a gay thing, Alex, that's a human thing. Everyone's scared of rejection, but the only way to find out is to take the leap." He looked at me, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," I admitted. "But it's worth it. And no matter what happens, you've got me in your corner. Always." The night ended on a hopeful note, the air between us cleared in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Alex's confession was the climax of a story that had been building for so long, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he didn't have to hide who he was. As he left that night, he turned back and said, "Thank you. For everything." I smiled and nodded, knowing that this moment had changed both of us in ways we were only just beginning to understand. After Alex's confession, things started to shift, but not in the dramatic way I might have imagined. Life didn't suddenly become perfect for him. He still had fears and uncertainties to work through. But something fundamental had changed. He was no longer carrying the weight of his secret alone. That, in itself, was freeing. The next morning, Alex texted me a simple thank you. It was brief but carried the depth of everything he couldn't put into words. I replied, "Always, because that's what family and friendship means to me." Over the following weeks, Alex started opening up more. He shared stories about moments in his life when he'd felt invisible, about times he had wanted to say something but didn't know how. He told me about the boy he liked, Chris, a coworker who always made him laugh but never seemed to notice the nervous energy Alex carried whenever they talked. We began to joke about it, our conversations light-hearted but meaningful. "You should ask him out," I'd tease, and Alex would roll his eyes, pretending to ignore the suggestion while I caught a faint smile creeping across his face. One day, Alex admitted he was considering it. "I don't know if he feels the same way," he said, "but I think I'm ready to find out." "Good," I said. "No matter what happens, you'll feel better knowing you tried." I saw Alex grow braver with each passing day, not just in the way he carried himself but in the way he began to embrace who he was. He started reconnecting with old friends, making new ones, and talking to me about things he'd never felt comfortable sharing before. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. One evening, Alex called me, his voice shaky. "I told Mom and Dad," he said, and I could tell from his tone that the conversation hadn't gone as well as he'd hoped. "They didn't take it well," he admitted. "They said they needed time to process, but I could tell they were upset." "Alex, that doesn't mean they won't come around," I reassured him. "Sometimes people just need time. You've had years to accept this about yourself. They've only had minutes. It doesn't mean they don't love you." He sighed. "I know, but it still hurts." "It's okay to feel that way," I said. "But don't let it make you doubt yourself. You're doing the right thing by being honest. Give them time, and in the meantime, lean on the people who support you." That night, I stayed on the phone with him for hours, reminding him that no matter what he wasn't alone. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Alex's parents began to soften. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but a series of small gestures, a kind word here, a warm hug there. They were trying, and Alex noticed. The real breakthrough came one Sunday afternoon when Alex's dad invited him to watch a game. "I don't care who you love," he said awkwardly but sincerely. "You're still my son, and I'm proud of you." Alex told me about it later, his voice filled with a mix of relief and joy. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's progress." As for Chris, that story was still unfolding. Alex finally mustered the courage to ask him out, and to his surprise, Chris said yes. Their first date was simple, a coffee shop and a walk in the park, but it was enough to make Alex believe that taking risks could lead to something beautiful. "I don't know where it's going," Alex told me afterward, "but for the first time, I feel like I'm living my life for me, not for anyone else." Hearing him say that made me realize how much he'd grown. The boy who once hid behind a wall of fear and self-doubt was learning to step into the light, one courageous step at a time. Our relationship changed too. We were closer now, bound not just by blood but by trust and understanding. I'd always thought I knew Alex, but his vulnerability had shown me a depth I hadn't seen before. The story didn't end with a perfect resolution, but that's the beauty of life, it's always a work in progress. Alex still had challenges to face, and so did I. But we were facing them together, and that made all the difference. As I sat on my balcony one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, I felt a sense of peace. Life is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes heartbreaking, but it's also full of moments that remind us why it's worth fighting for connection and authenticity. I glanced at my phone, where Alex's latest message popped up. "Guess what? Chris wants to meet you. He says anyone who means that much to me must be pretty awesome." I smiled, typing back, looking forward to it. Alex's journey wasn't over, but he was finally walking a path that felt true to him. And as I watched the sun set over the horizon, I realized that this wasn't just his story, it was ours, a testament to love, courage, and the power of being seen.